Since a memory is a false memory that convinced you it was real, ask yourself something uncomfortable. The one you're having right now, the sense that this sentence, this room, this exact moment already happened to you once before. How would you know if it were lying? There was a man in Bath, England, in his 80s, a retired engineer. His name in the case file was just 2 letters, AKP, to protect him. But his story is the one I want you to sit with before anything else, because it is the closest anyone has come to showing what happens when the thing that's supposed to catch a false memory simply stops showing up for work. AKP wouldn't watch television, he wouldn't read the newspaper, not because he'd lost interest in the world, because every single time, without fail, he already knew what was coming. A newscaster would open her mouth to deliver a headline, and he would feel it land in him as something old, already seen, already lived. He'd turn to his wife sometimes and say he didn't need to watch, he'd seen this one before. And when she pushed back, when she told him plainly that, no, this was new, this was today's news, he had an answer ready that should chill you more than it first sounds like it would. He said, "How would I know? I have a memory problem." Sit with that sentence for a second because it's doing something strange. He wasn't confused about what a memory problem was. He knew on some level that his sense of certainty couldn't be trusted. And yet the feeling of having lived through the news broadcast, of having already sat in that chair and heard those words, that feeling did not go away just because he knew it might be false. He was aware his brain might be lying to him, and it changed nothing about how convinced he felt in the moment. I want you to notice what that means because it's the seed of everything in the next hour. Most of us have felt a flicker of this, a room you swear you've stood in before, a conversation that seems to be replaying rather than happening. It lasts a few seconds, it unsettles you. And then it's gone, and some part of your mind quietly tells you, that wasn't real, move on. AKP had the first half of that experience running almost constantly. What he'd lost was the second half. The part that says, no, actually, this is new. Here's the reframe I want to put in front of you and then leave alone for a while, because it deserves more than one sentence. What if that fleeting, eerie feeling most of us get every so often isn't a malfunction at all? What if it's the opposite, a system in your head successfully catching a lie your memory just tried to tell you and flagging it out loud as a feeling? And what if the truly frightening cases aren't the people who feel déjà vu, but the people who don't anymore, because the part of them that would have caught it has gone quiet? Hold that. We're coming back to AKP and to a second patient like him later because his case gets stranger and because there's a moment near the end of this hour where his condition connects to something happening in your own skull right now, tonight, whether you've ever consciously noticed it or not. But first I want to tell you where this entire way of thinking came from, because it didn't come from a ghost story or a late-night forum. It came from a book that dragged this phenomenon, kicking and screaming, out of the world of psychics and past lives and into a laboratory. The book is called The Déjà Vu Experience. The author is a research psychologist named Alan Brown, and I want to be honest with you about how I found it. I wasn't looking for anything spooky. I was looking for what's actually known, as opposed to what people online insist is known, about this one strange universal glitch. And what I found was more unsettling than the mystical version, not less. Brown's project back in 2004 was almost bureaucratic in ambition. Take every serious theory anyone had proposed about déjà vu across decades and organize it. Sort the psychic claims out. Keep what could actually be tested. He built, essentially, a filing system for a feeling that had never had one. I went into his work expecting to find a tidy single answer somewhere in the back chapters. Here's what déjà vu actually is, case closed. I came out of it with something else. A working theory, real experiments, real patients, and an honest admission, repeated by nearly everyone who has studied this seriously, that we still do not fully know what flips the switch. That admission is going to matter a great deal by the end of this hour. Hold on to it the way you'd hold on to a loose thread. Brown's book anchors what I'm about to walk you through, but it isn't the only voice. A researcher named Anne Cleary picked up this thread more recently and ran experiments that, when I read them, made me sit back from my desk. and a clinical psychologist named Chris Moulin, the same man who examined AKP, pushed the idea further than almost anyone. That déjà vu isn't a symptom of a broken memory system. It's evidence that your memory system's oversight committee is doing exactly its job. I want to flag this plainly, the way I'll flag every big claim in this hour. That specific framing, déjà vu is your brain's fact-checker catching itself, is Moulin's interpretation. It is not the one settled answer the whole field agrees on, but it is, I think, the most useful lens for understanding everything else you're about to hear. And by the end, you'll understand why serious researchers keep circling back to it. So let's build this properly, the way Brown built it, piece by piece, patient by patient, experiment by experiment, because the individual pieces are stranger on their own than any single headline could tell you. Start with the feeling itself, stripped down to its plainest description, because most of what you think you know about déjà vu is folk wisdom, not evidence. The name comes from French, déjà vu, already seen, coined by a man named Émile Boirac in 1876 in a letter, a century and a half before neuroscience had the tools to touch it. For most of that century and a half, the phenomenon lived in the same drawer as ghost sightings and past life memories. People assumed it meant something mystical, a glimpse of a previous life, a psychic echo, a crack in time itself. That's the popular story. It is almost entirely not what the research says. Here's the first fact that should surprise you, because it cuts directly against the spooky version. Déjà vu is not a phenomenon of the old and the wise, the kind of thing that accumulates with age like a sixth sense, sharpened by decades of living. It's the opposite. It happens far more often in young people, and it fades measurably the older you get. Think about what that means for a second. If déjà vu were memory quietly breaking down, the same kind of decay that shows up as forgetting names, misplacing keys, losing the thread of a story, you'd expect it to get worse with age, the way most memory problems do. Instead, it does the reverse. It's most active precisely when your memory system is at its sharpest, most efficient, most reliable. That's backwards, if déjà vu is a malfunction. It makes much more sense if déjà vu is a checking process, because a checking process that's alert and fast is exactly what you'd expect from a young, well-tuned brain, and exactly what you'd expect to go quiet as that system slows down. Let that sit for a moment, because I'm going to ask you to hold two competing pictures in your head at once for the rest of this hour, and this is the first crack between them. Picture 1. Déjà vu is a symptom, a stutter, a hiccup in an aging or damaged brain. Picture 2. Déjà vu is a security guard's flashlight sweeping across a room and catching something. A fast, healthy, working alarm system, briefly tripping over a false signal and telling you about it. The age data points hard at picture 2. And once you start looking at it that way, something else falls into place that you've probably felt yourself and never questioned. Why does déjà vu never last? Why is it always 3 seconds, 5 seconds, gone? An alarm that succeeds doesn't need to keep ringing. It fires once, does its job, and shuts off. Now, I promised you the strangest idea early, and I'm going to make good on that promise, but not by explaining it yet. There's a finding buried in Cleary's research from 2018 that seems at first to have nothing to do with any of this. It's about déjà vu and your sense of what's about to happen next. It's going to make the fact-checker idea feel less comforting than it does right now. I'm not ready to show you that one yet. First, you need the machinery underneath the feeling, because without it, that finding won't land the way it should. So let's talk about what's actually happening mechanically in a completely healthy brain when you remember anything at all, because the leading account of déjà vu doesn't start with déjà vu. It starts with an idea about ordinary memory that most people have never once been told, despite it happening in their heads thousands of times a day. When you recognize something, a face in a crowd, a smell in an old house, a line in a book you've definitely read before, your brain isn't running one single process called remembering. It's running two, and they usually move together so seamlessly you'd never guess they were separate at all. The first is fast. It's a kind of gut-level ping. I know this. No details attached, no timestamp, no story, just a flash of recognition, the way a bell rings before you've thought about why. Researchers call this familiarity. The second process is slower, and it's the one that actually feels like remembering in the way we normally mean it. You don't just sense that you know this face, you can place it. You recall the party where you met her, the joke that got told, the drink she was holding. That's called recollection. It comes loaded with context: when, where, what else was happening. Ordinarily, these two signals arrive together, practically as one experience. You see an old classmate at a grocery store, the familiarity ping fires, and half a heartbeat later the recollection catches up. The classroom, the teacher's name, the year. It happens so fast, so automatically, that most people go their whole lives without ever noticing there were two separate steps at all. This idea, that recognition memory is actually two dissociable systems working in parallel, comes out of decades of work by researchers named Larry Jacoby and George Mandler, going back to the 1980s. I want to be precise about who did what here, because it matters. Jacoby and Mandler built the general framework. It was Anne Cleary, decades later, who took that framework and asked the specific, unsettling question: what happens when familiarity fires all by itself, when the bell rings and recollection never shows up to explain why? That, in plain language, is the leading account of déjà vu. Not proven beyond doubt, I'll say clearly more than once that this remains the leading interpretation rather than a settled fact, but it is the account with the most direct experimental support behind it, and here is where it stops being an abstract idea and becomes something you can actually watch happen. Cleary built an experiment using virtual reality, video game environments, essentially, built to test one very specific question. She had people walk through virtual scenes, a garden maybe, or a junkyard, or a courtyard. Later, she had them walk through entirely new scenes, new content, new objects, new dressing, but secretly built on the exact same spatial layout as scenes they'd seen before. Same arrangement of walls and pathways, same configuration of turns, different everything else. And here's what happened. People reported déjà vu, not sometimes, reliably, tied directly to the hidden spatial repeat. They'd walk into a scene that, consciously, they were certain they'd never seen. New objects, new colors, a totally different looking place, and something in them would still ring like a bell. I know this. They couldn't say why. They didn't recognize the content, because the content really was new. What they were recognizing, without knowing it, was the shape of the space itself, the skeleton underneath the room, stripped of everything that made it look unfamiliar. Think about what that means for you, walking into an unfamiliar house at a party or a hotel room in a city you've never visited, and feeling that a strange prickle of, "I've been here." Cleary's work suggests you may never have seen that house at all. You may have seen its shape. A hallway that bends the same way as one from your childhood home. A room with a window in the same corner as an office you sat in years ago. Your familiarity system doesn't check content, it checks structure. And it will ring the bell for a structure it recognizes, even while every conscious part of you insists, correctly, that the room itself is brand new. Here's an image worth holding on to, because it's going to do a lot of work over the next stretch of this hour. Think of a photocopy that's laid out exactly like a page you've read before. Same margins, same paragraph breaks, same shape on the page. But every single word on it has been swapped out for something else. If you glanced at it for half a second, some part of you might swear you'd read this page. Not because you had, because the shape fooled the part of you that checks shape, and the part of you that checks words never got consulted at all. So now you have the first half of the machinery. Familiarity can fire on its own, triggered by nothing more than a spatial pattern, completely divorced from whether you actually experience the thing in front of you. That's proven. Cleary's experiment is real, repeatable, published. What's still interpretation is whether this is the whole explanation for every case of déjà vu anyone has ever felt. It might explain a large share of the everyday version. It almost certainly doesn't explain all of it. And there's a very different kind of evidence from a very different kind of subject that widens the picture in an even stranger direction. That different kind of evidence comes from people whose brains produce this feeling not as a rare oddity, but as a warning light wired directly into a malfunction. People with a specific kind of epilepsy, seated in a hospital bed decades ago, with electrodes touching the surface of an awake, talking human brain. In 1963, a neurosurgeon named Penfield, working with a colleague named Perrault at the Montreal Neurological Institute, was operating on patients with epilepsy so severe that surgery was the last option left. The patients were conscious, their skulls were open, and Penfield did something that sounds almost unbelievable now. He touched electrodes to different points on the exposed brain, one after another, while the patient lay there and reported out loud whatever they experienced. Picture it from the patient's side. You're awake. There is no pain because the brain itself has no pain receptors. Only the scalp had to be numbed to get inside. A surgeon touches a small point on your temporal lobe with a mild electrical current and asks, "What do you feel?" For most points, the answer was nothing, or a twitch, or a flash of light. But at a small number of specific sites, in a minority of these patients, something else happened. They reported the unmistakable sensation of having lived this exact moment before. Not a memory of a similar day, the specific uncanny certainty that this precise moment, the surgical room, the doctor's question, had already happened to them once, somewhere, at some earlier point they couldn't name. I want to be careful with this one, because it's tempting to tell it as a cleaner story than it actually is. It wasn't a single reliable button that made déjà vu appear on command, and it didn't happen at every site Penfield touched, or in every patient. It happened at a scattered handful of points, inconsistently, and modern researchers looking back at this work have pointed out that Penfield's own descriptions of exactly which regions were responsible don't line up cleanly with what later, more precise studies of temporal lobe epilepsy have found. Today, the trigger point looks like it sits closer to structures buried underneath the temporal lobe, tissue folded up against the hippocampus, rather than the outer surface Penfield was mapping. So this is not scientists found the déjà vu button in 1963, and it's been confirmed ever since. It's closer to a serious, careful surgeon found the first hard evidence that this feeling could be triggered by direct contact with brain tissue at all in anyone, and it took decades afterward to even begin narrowing down where. But sit with what that first evidence actually means, regardless of the precise geography. A feeling that most of us treat as mystical, unexplainable, almost supernatural, the sense of somehow already having lived this exact second, could be produced by a few milliamps of current touching a few millimeters of tissue. Not induced by a past life, not a crack in the fabric of time, a location, a circuit. Something you could, with the right instrument and the right patient, reach out and touch with a metal probe. This is where the picture from Cleary's virtual courtyards and the picture from Penfield's operating room start to rhyme with each other, even though they come from completely different directions. One is healthy volunteers walking through video game gardens, showing that familiarity can misfire from spatial pattern alone. The other is patients with damaged, electrically unstable brain tissue, showing that the same feeling can be produced directly, by force, bypassing whatever normal circumstances usually trigger it. Two separate roads arriving at the same intersection, a familiarity signal that can be switched on without anything real underneath it. And there's a further piece of this that belongs here, because it isn't a historical curiosity. It's a documented, ongoing medical reality. For a specific group of people with a form of epilepsy centered in the temporal lobe, déjà vu isn't an occasional strange evening. It's a seizure warning. Doctors call it an aura, a subjective sensation that arrives just before, or as the very first stage of, a seizure that the patient remains conscious through. For these patients, the feeling of, "I've lived this exact moment before," isn't a passing curiosity to shrug off on the way to the kitchen. It's their nervous system's early warning system for a different kind of electrical storm entirely. One that happens to borrow the exact same subjective costume as the déjà vu the rest of us feel once every few months. Now hold that next to something I need you to really absorb, because it's the piece that turns this from an interesting fact into something closer to vertigo. If a diseased brain can produce the feeling of déjà vu through nothing but abnormal electrical noise near the hippocampus, with no real repeated experience underneath it at all, then the feeling itself, the raw, subjective sensation you get when you walk into a room and think, "I've been here," That feeling carries no built-in guarantee of truth. It is not proof of anything. It is not a signal that can only be produced by something real happening to you. It is, mechanically, just a pattern of neural firing that can be triggered by a video game hallway with the right dimensions, or by a few millimeters of misfiring tissue, or, presumably, by whatever ordinary and still poorly understood combination of circumstances gives the rest of us that shiver a few times a year. Which brings me back, finally, to the thing I told you to hold on to. The "not yet" I owed you from the start of this hour. Cleary didn't stop at proving familiarity could misfire on its own. In 2018, she ran a further study that took the feeling of déjà vu and asked it a much more specific, much more dangerous question. When you feel this, do you also feel like you know what's about to happen next? Because most people who've had déjà vu will tell you that's part of it. Not just, "I've been here," but a faint, eerie sense of anticipation, a pull, as if the next few seconds are already written and you're simply catching up to them. Cleary built VR environments again, ones that would reliably produce that déjà vu sensation through the same hidden spatial repeat trick. And this time, she asked her participants in the moment whether they felt like they could predict what was coming next in the scene. And they said yes. Overwhelmingly, people who felt déjà vu also reported a genuine sense that they knew somehow what was about to happen, which way the path would turn, what would appear around the corner. Then she checked whether they actually could. They couldn't. Their guesses about what came next were no better than chance, no better than someone who'd felt nothing at all and was simply asked to guess blind. The feeling of foreknowledge was completely real, subjectively, urgently real, and completely disconnected from any actual predictive ability whatsoever. People weren't lying, and they weren't imagining the sensation to be polite to the researcher. They were reporting an honest, vivid conviction that turned out to be, measurably, false. I want you to feel the weight of that for a second, because I don't think it gets enough weight when people talk about déjà vu casually. It's one thing to say a feeling of familiarity can be wrong. That's already strange, but it's abstract. It's another thing entirely to learn that the feeling of knowing your own immediate future can arrive with full conviction, full confidence, the same textured certainty as any other true memory you've ever had, and be nothing. Not a partial signal, not a weak hunch dressed up as more, a dead end, wearing the exact costume of a real prediction. Now put that finding next to something else entirely, because there's a second explanation for déjà vu on the table, and it comes from a completely different direction. Not from spatial layouts or damaged tissue, but from something as mundane as not paying attention. Alan Brown, the same researcher whose book started this whole investigation, ran an experiment with a colleague named Elizabeth Marsh back in 2009. The setup sounds almost too simple to matter. They showed people photographs of places, ordinary locations, campus buildings, street scenes, and asked them later to rate how familiar each one felt. Nothing unusual there. Except hidden inside the sequence, some of those photographs had already been flashed in front of the same people earlier for a fraction of a second, 10 to 20 milliseconds, faster than a blink, fast enough that consciously nobody registered having seen anything at all. And those briefly flashed photographs came back rated as more familiar. Not dramatically, but reliably, measurably more familiar than photographs that had never appeared before at all. Something in these people's visual systems had registered that flash, filed it away, and let it quietly nudge their sense of familiarity upward later, without ever surfacing into conscious awareness as a memory of having seen it. Think about what your eyes are doing right now, in any ordinary hour of your life. You walk into a coffee shop while scrolling your phone. You glance, without looking, at a bulletin board, a window display, a stranger's jacket, while your attention is somewhere else entirely. A text message, a thought about your afternoon, a song in your headphones. Your eyes catch all of it. Your conscious attention catches almost none of it. Brown and Marsh's experiment suggests that gap doesn't mean nothing happened. It means something got recorded below the floor of your awareness, filed without a label, without a timestamp, without the story attached, and it can resurface later as nothing more than an unexplained hum of familiarity, with no memory of the moment that planted it. That reframes something almost everyone has experienced and shrugged off. You walk into a restaurant for what you're sure is the first time, and something about it feels quietly, naggingly familiar. The layout, the lighting, you can't say what. Under this theory, you may genuinely have glimpsed it before, through a car window on a drive you weren't paying attention to, in a photo someone scrolled past on a phone in a waiting room, in the corner of a video you half-watched. Your conscious mind kept none of it. Some other part of you kept all of it and is now quietly ringing a bell it can't explain. Here's the honest complication, though, and I want to give it to you plainly rather than let this theory sound like the whole answer, because it isn't. Divided attention explains a certain flavor of déjà vu well, the mild, low-grade, something about this place feeling. It doesn't obviously explain the more intense version people describe, the kind that comes with a jolt, a near vertigo, an almost frightening certainty, the kind AKP lived inside permanently. A glimpse you didn't consciously register doesn't naturally produce that kind of overwhelming conviction. So what you're left with, honestly, is not one clean mechanism, but several real, independently supported ones, each explaining a piece of the territory, none of them claiming the whole map. And there is a rival explanation, older than any of these, that deserves to be told fully and fairly, because it's the one most people have actually heard of, even if they don't know the name behind it. In 1963, the same year Penfield was touching electrodes to exposed brain tissue in Montreal, a researcher named Robert Efron proposed something almost mechanical in its elegance. He suggested that visual information reaches the brain's processing centers, not through one pathway, but through two, arriving at the dominant hemisphere a fraction of a second apart, one slightly delayed relative to the other. If that delayed second copy arrives late enough to be processed as if it were a separate, distinct experience, your brain would register it as a repeat. Not because anything had actually happened twice, because one single moment got processed twice, milliseconds apart, and the second pass felt like an echo of the first. It's a beautiful theory in the way a piece of clockwork is beautiful. You can practically see it in your mind. Two signals racing down two wires, one arriving just behind the other, tricking the brain into thinking history had repeated. I want to be fair to it, because it's not a stupid idea, and it's not a debunked one either, in the sense of having been actively disproven by some cleaner piece of evidence. What's actually true 60 years on is quieter than that. Nobody has found solid experimental support for it. It hasn't been shot down, it's been quietly passed over, because there was never a way to actually test two wires in the human brain arriving milliseconds apart, and because the familiarity and recollection account kept producing real, repeatable, VR-tested evidence while Efron's theory produced none. Call it what current reviews call it, not disproven, but superseded, the intuitive, mechanical explanation that never got its data. Which brings the tally to where any honest account of this has to leave it. No fewer than 3 credible mechanisms sit on the table right now. Familiarity misfiring from spatial pattern alone, familiarity nudged upward by attention you never consciously spent, and familiarity triggered directly by abnormal electrical activity near damaged tissue. 3 separate, independently evidenced roads into the same subjective destination. And not one of them, alone or together, has been shown to fully explain every case of this feeling that a human being has ever reported. That's not a gap in my research, that's the honest state of the field. Now, return to Chris Moulin, the clinician who examined AKP, because there's a second patient in that same case report from 2005 that I haven't told you yet. And it matters, not because it repeats AKP's story, but because it shows this wasn't one strange man's private catastrophe. It was a pattern. This second patient, like AKP, suffered from a progressive dementia, and like AKP, lived inside a near constant conviction of already having experienced whatever was currently happening. But where AKP's version showed up mostly as a flat refusal, he wouldn't watch, wouldn't read, because what was the point? This second patient's mind did something more active, more unsettling in a different direction. When pressed to explain how they could possibly already know something they'd never been told, they didn't simply insist they were right. They built an explanation, a story generated on the spot, confident and detailed, accounting for how they could have known. Moulin has a specific clinical term for this, recollective confabulation, the mind not just misfiring on familiarity, but actively constructing an elaborate, false, entirely sincere memory to justify a conviction that had no real basis at all. This is the detail that should sit uneasily with you longer than AKPs alone. It isn't only that the alarm can ring falsely, it's that when the alarm rings and nobody comes to check it, the rest of the mind doesn't sit with the discomfort of an unexplained certainty. It fills the gap. It writes a memory to match the feeling, after the fact, with total sincerity, and hands it to you finished, as if it had been there all along. There's one more case that belongs here, and it's the most recent, and in some ways the strangest, because it does something none of the others do. It shows a single human brain telling the difference between the honest version of this feeling and the broken version in real time. In 2021, researchers working with Cleary published a case report on a patient with a form of epilepsy centered in the medial temporal lobe, the same deep folded tissue near the hippocampus that modern work points to as the likely source of Penfield's electrical déjà vu decades earlier. This patient had electrodes implanted directly into his brain, not for an experiment, but for standard clinical monitoring, the kind of procedure used to pinpoint exactly where a patient's seizures originate before considering surgery. That gave researchers something almost unheard of, a live feed of this man's brain activity, moment to moment, while he lived an ordinary life inside a hospital room. And here's the detail that makes this case worth sitting with. This man got déjà vu twice, in two entirely different registers, and he could tell them apart. He had ordinary person déjà vu, the kind you or I might get once every few months, walking into a diner, catching a stray sense of "I've done this before," gone in a few seconds, mildly interesting, nothing more. And separately, tied directly to his seizures, he had a second kind, the aura, the electrical warning sign, arriving as the opening note of a seizure. His implanted electrodes were simultaneously recording in real time. When researchers asked him, he didn't describe these as the same experience wearing two names. He described them as different. The seizure-linked version had its own particular texture, its own weight, distinguishable, in his own words, from the ordinary kind. And the recordings backed him up. The electrical signature accompanying his seizure déjà vu was measurably different from whatever quiet, unmeasured process was producing his ordinary version. Think about what that means, held up against everything you've heard so far. Here is a single human nervous system capable of producing this feeling through at least two separate channels, one tied to genuine, documented epileptic misfiring, one tied to something else, something ordinary, something his brain does the way your brain does it, unlinked to any seizure at all, and he could tell the two apart from the inside. Not because a doctor explained the difference to him first, because they simply felt different to him as he lived through them. That should reshape how you think about your own experience of this feeling whenever it last happened to you. It isn't one undifferentiated flicker with one single cause hiding behind it. It's the visible symptom of what might be several different processes in several different brains, or even within the same brain, and the only tool any of us has for telling one from another, most of the time, is a fleeting, wordless texture that vanishes before we can examine it. Now, put the two sides of this investigation directly against each other, because this is where the whole shape of the problem comes into focus. On one side, cognitive memory science, Cleary's spatial configuration experiments, Brown and Marsh's subliminal priming study, Jacobi and Mandler's dual process framework underneath all of it. This entire body of work studies healthy volunteers, intact brains, controlled laboratory conditions, and arrives at a picture of familiarity and recollection as two separable systems that can, under specific and reproducible circumstances, come apart. On the other side, clinical neurology, Penfield's exposed cortex, AKP, in the second patient in Moulin's case report, the 2021 patient with electrodes threaded into his hippocampus. This entire body of work studies damaged or abnormally firing brains and arrives at a picture of a checking process that can fail outright, leaving familiarity running unsupervised indefinitely, with nothing above it to say no. These two fields were not built to talk to each other. One grew out of psychology labs running volunteers through virtual courtyards. The other grew out of hospital wards and operating theaters, decades apart, driven by completely different questions. one asking how memory normally works, the other asking what goes wrong when a diseased brain breaks. And yet they have converged from two entirely separate directions on the exact same underlying claim, that the sense of, I know this, and the sense of, I know this because I actually experienced it before, are not one thing wearing two faces. They are two different systems, built separately, that happen most of the time in a healthy adult brain to arrive at the same conclusion together. Here's the part that unsettled me most once I saw it laid out like this. The distance between an ordinary person's 3-second déjà vu and AKP's permanent déjà vécu isn't a difference in kind. It's a difference in whether the checking system that catches the false signal is present at all. In Cleary's volunteers, familiarity misfires briefly, and recollection, or the absence of it, steps in fast enough to flag the error before it can take root, and the whole thing resolves in a few seconds as a curious little shiver. In AKP, and in the second patient beside him, familiarity misfires just as easily, constantly, relentlessly, and there's no functioning system left standing behind it to say, no, actually, check again. What's different isn't the alarm, it's whether anyone is still listening to it. There's a related idea worth naming honestly here, because it would be dishonest to leave it out, and equally dishonest to overstate it. Researchers who study false memories, the phenomenon of people confidently recalling events in vivid detail that never actually happened to them, describe the underlying failure using a term called source monitoring, the mind losing track of where a memory-like feeling actually originated. It's tempting to draw a straight line from that research directly to déjà vu, as if they were one long-running joint investigation. They're not. There's no documented collaboration linking the two bodies of work directly. What connects them is something quieter and, in its way, more disturbing. The same underlying vulnerability, showing up twice in two different corners of memory science, discovered independently by researchers who weren't necessarily even reading each other's papers. A mind that can mistake an unfamiliar hallway for a familiar one, using nothing but shape, is running on the same basic architecture as a mind that can mistake a suggested detail for something it personally witnessed. Different symptom. Same underlying seam in how memory checks its own work. Turn all of that inward, onto your own life, because that's where it actually belongs. Every memory you're carrying right now, not the strange ones, the ordinary ones, the ones you'd stake your identity on, pass through this exact same two-part system on its way into your head and passes through some version of it every time you pull it back out. The morning you got married, the day you got the phone call, the face of someone who isn't here anymore. Each one of those, every time you revisit it, is being reconstructed by the same familiarity signal and the same recollection signal that just misfired for a stranger in a virtual courtyard, that just fired without provocation in a diseased hippocampus, that just built an entire false justification on the spot for a man who had no real memory underneath his certainty at all. Most of the time, this system runs so cleanly you'd never suspect it was two systems at all. That's precisely why it's frightening. You don't get a warning light for a healthy, well-calibrated memory. You only get the warning light when something goes wrong loudly enough to notice. The 3-second shiver, the eerie hallway, the newscast AKP swore he'd already seen. The rest of the time, the checking process is working invisibly, silently, constantly, approving memory after memory without ever once asking for your attention. You have no way of independently verifying it's doing its job correctly. You only find out it's broken when it fails in a way dramatic enough to feel strange. Which means, right now, at this moment, you have no actual way of knowing how many of your quiet, unflagged, perfectly confident memories are running on nothing more than an unchecked familiarity signal that simply never got caught. That's the trade this whole hour has been circling. The feeling that unsettles you, the shiver, the déjà vu, the sense that something's wrong with this room, isn't the scary part. It's the reassuring part. It's proof the checking system is still on duty, still doing its job, still willing to interrupt you with a strange little flag when something in your memory doesn't add up. The genuinely frightening version isn't the moment you notice déjà vu. It's every other moment, The vast, silent majority of your memories, where nothing interrupts you at all, and you have absolutely no way of knowing whether that silence means everything checked out or whether it simply means nobody was watching. Consider what this actually costs you, practically, day to day. Think of the last time you were completely certain about something you remembered. An argument, a promise, who said what first, certain enough to argue the point, certain enough to correct someone else's version of events. That certainty felt exactly the same, from the inside, as AKP's certainty that he'd already watched tonight's news. Exactly the same as the VR participants' false conviction that they knew which way the path would turn. The feeling of being right and the fact of being right are produced by two different mechanisms entirely, and only one of them is actually checking your work. There's a particular kind of vertigo in realizing that confidence itself carries no information about accuracy. You'd expect a stronger feeling of certainty to mean a memory is more reliable. That's the whole intuitive promise certainty makes you. But Cleary's participants felt just as certain about their false predictions as anyone ever feels about a memory that turns out to be entirely accurate. The volume of the feeling and the truth of the feeling are unrelated dials, sitting side by side on the same control panel, and nothing about how loud one is tells you anything about where the other is set. If any of this is the kind of thing that keeps you turning it over hours later, staring at the ceiling, that's more or less the exact reason this channel exists, and subscribing is probably a good idea if you want to keep going down rabbit holes like it. And here's the detail that keeps this from ever fully resolving, no matter how many labs study it. Nobody has figured out how to make déjà vu happen reliably, on command, in an otherwise healthy volunteer sitting in an ordinary room. Cleary's virtual courtyards get close. They can raise the odds, tilt the dice, but even in her own experiments, only a portion of participants report the feeling, and never with certainty, never as a clean, repeatable switch anyone can flip whenever they want data. Penfield's electrode had to be touching diseased or unusually excitable tissue to work at all, and even then it only worked at some points, in some patients, unpredictably. The feeling that visits nearly every person alive multiple times across a lifetime remains one that science cannot summon into a laboratory on demand, cannot hold still long enough to record its full signature in an undamaged brain, and cannot yet fully explain even after a century and a half of people trying. Moulin himself hasn't stopped chasing this. He continues this work now from Université Grenoble-Alpes, a research center in the French Alps, a long way from the memory clinic in Bath, where he first sat across from AKP. And Brown's own book, the one that started all of this, the one that pulled the subject out of seances and into a laboratory, got a second edition in 2020, written this time with Cleary alongside him. Two researchers who came at this feeling from different angles, Brown from the historical taxonomy, Cleary from the virtual reality experiments, ended up years later writing the update together. That alone tells you something about where the field actually stands, not a settled textbook chapter, a living argument still being revised by the same people who built it because the evidence keeps arriving faster than any one theory can absorb it. Part of why it stays unsettled is a plain, practical problem nobody has solved. Even under the best laboratory conditions anyone has built, the feeling is a flicker. Cleary's participants who reported déjà vu in her VR courtyards experienced it for a matter of seconds, same as anyone does walking through an ordinary room. And by the time a researcher could physically get a scanner or a probe close enough to catch the exact neural signature underneath it, the moment had already dissolved. You cannot easily study something honestly only when it's already fading. Compare that to Penfield's operating room, where the moment could at least be pinned to a specific instant, an electrode touching a specific patch of tissue, a specific second on the clock, except that setting required an already diseased brain, already scheduled for surgery, which means it can never tell you what an undamaged brain's version of this looks like from the inside, at the exact neural level while it's happening. Every method anyone has devised trades one kind of access for another. The healthy brain studies get natural, ordinary déjà vu, but only questionnaires and reaction times, never a direct look at the tissue in the act. The diseased brain studies get the direct look, but only because something has already gone wrong. That gap is exactly why no one can yet hand you a single, complete account of your own experience the next time it happens to you. Not because nobody's looked hard enough, because the feeling seems built, almost deliberately, to slip out from under the exact tools we have for pinning it down, brief, unrepeatable on command, and dependent for its clearest evidence on brains that are, in one way or another, not behaving normally to begin with. Picture the fire alarm for a moment, because it explains something about that bath hospital room better than any clinical term could. A fire alarm that goes off with no fire in the building isn't lying to you about everything. It's honest about one thing and wrong about another. It really did detect something: heat, smoke particles, some genuine signal in the air. What it got wrong was the interpretation. There is no fire. There was something, but not that. That's the shape of ordinary déjà vu, almost exactly. Your familiarity system really did detect something real, a shape, a layout, a fragment glimpsed and forgotten. It just attached the wrong story to it. Not a fire, not an actual repeated experience. Something else entirely, dressed up in the one costume familiarity knows how to wear. Now think about what happens when that same alarm has a dead battery. Not a false alarm this time, the opposite. A dead smoke detector doesn't ring falsely, it doesn't ring at all. The smoke can fill the room, thick and visible, and the little box on the ceiling stays silent, because whatever was supposed to notice and respond has simply stopped functioning. Nobody in the room gets a warning, false or otherwise. That is closer to what happened inside AKP. It would be a mistake to picture his condition as a fire alarm going off constantly, blaring at every newscast and every conversation. It's closer to a house where the alarm never had the chance to be wrong because the wiring behind it had already failed. Familiarity kept firing. That part still worked, loud and constant, but there was no functioning circuit left standing behind it that could ever answer back. Check again. This doesn't add up. Not a false alarm sounding too often, a true alarm that had lost its ability to be questioned at all. There's a third image worth sitting with, because it captures something the fire alarm can't. Think about a GPS unit recalculating your route on a road you've genuinely never driven. You know intellectually you've never been on this stretch of highway before. And yet something about the curve of the exit ramp, the angle it peels away from the highway, the way the overpass sits against the sky, some part of your orienting sense responds to it as though it recognizes the pattern even while the address on the map is completely new to you. That's Cleary's discovery in a single image. Recognition doesn't require the destination to be familiar. It only requires the shape of the road getting there. Walk through her actual experiment again, slower this time, because the procedure itself deserves more than a summary. Participants were seated in front of a screen, given a joystick or a set of directional keys, and moved through a rendered environment built in ordinary video game software. Nothing exotic, nothing that would have looked out of place in a mid-2000s PC game. First, they explored a set of these scenes freely, taking in the layout, the walls, the objects scattered through each room. Later, in a second phase they weren't told was connected to the first, they explored a fresh batch of scenes, different furniture, different color schemes, different objects entirely. But for a subset of these new scenes, the underlying floor plan, the actual geometry of walls and turns and open spaces, had been secretly copied from scenes they'd already walked through earlier. The people running through these secretly repeated layouts didn't casually mention a vague sense of déjà vu when prompted. They reported it unprompted, sometimes stopping mid-navigation to say so, describing the same eerie quality anyone would use to describe the feeling in ordinary life. Not, "This looks similar," in a considered analytical way, but the same startled, involuntary, "Wait, I've been here," that arrives before you've had time to think about why. And when researchers then asked them to explain why the space felt familiar, participants reached for the content, the furniture, the objects, the colors, because that's what conscious attention had actually been tracking. None of them landed on the truth. None of them said, unprompted, "It's the shape of the room." The real cause was sitting one full level below whatever they had conscious access to, doing its work invisibly, while their conscious mind scrambled to invent an explanation using the only material it had on hand, exactly the same scramble that produced the second bath patient's confident, detailed, entirely false justification for a memory that was never real to begin with. And there's a fourth image that belongs here because it captures what the temporal lobe cases are actually like from the inside, in a way the fire alarm and the dead battery both miss. Think about static on an old radio dial, the kind that used to hiss between stations. Every so often, buried in that noise, you'd catch something that sounded almost like a station you knew, a fragment of a voice, a snatch of melody, close enough that some part of you leaned in, convinced for half a second that you'd found it, before the noise swallowed it again. That's what an abnormal electrical discharge near the hippocampus seems to do to the familiarity system. It isn't feeding it a genuine signal from the outside world at all. It's noise, plain electrical noise, misrouted through the exact circuitry that normally produces the feeling of recognition. And the feeling comes out sounding from the inside, indistinguishable from the real thing, the way a burst of static can sound, for one disorienting second, exactly like a station you know by heart. These four pictures aren't decorative. Each one is doing real work, mapping onto a specific mechanism this hour has walked through. The honest but misattributed alarm for familiarity, firing on a real but misread signal. The dead battery for a checking system that has gone silent rather than false. The GPS recalculating for structure without content recognition. The radio static for electrical noise dressed up as memory. 4 different failure modes, 4 different origins, one single subjective costume that all of them wear once they reach the surface of conscious experience. That convergence is itself worth pausing on. Whatever this feeling actually is, mechanically, upstream, a misread pattern, a silent checker, a structural echo, a burst of noise, by the time it reaches the part of you that can put it into words, it has already been flattened into one indistinguishable sensation. You are the last stop in the chain, and by the time the signal reaches you, the causes have already been erased. Think, too, about the sheer asymmetry of it. A healthy brain runs this checking process billions of times across a life, silently, successfully, without a single flicker of conscious sensation to mark most of those successes. You don't feel your recollection system confirm a memory correctly. You only feel the rare instance where it fails to confirm or fails to intervene at all. That means the feeling of déjà vu, however unsettling in the moment, is actually evidence of the system's staggeringly high success rate the rest of the time. Because if a checking process failed constantly, you wouldn't experience occasional eerie flickers, you'd experience something closer to what AKP lived inside permanently. The rarity of the feeling in a healthy person is itself a kind of hidden statistic, quietly telling you how well the system usually works, precisely because you almost never notice it working at all. There is a man in Bath, England, who does not read the newspaper because he has already read it. And his wife, standing in the doorway, tells him, "No, this is today's news, this is happening now." And he answers with a sentence that has been sitting underneath everything I've told you for the last hour. How would I know? I have a memory problem. I don't think that sentence belongs only to him anymore. Every memory you carry, every certainty you'd stake your name on, passed through the same 2-part machinery that failed him completely and flickers briefly and honestly in the rest of us. The difference between his permanent déjà vécu and your last ordinary shiver of déjà vu was never the presence of a false signal. False signals are constant, quiet, and everywhere. The difference was whether anything was still standing behind it, willing to ask the signal to prove itself. So the next time it happens to you, the room that feels wrong in a way you can't name, the sentence that seems to be repeating rather than arriving, don't reach first for the unease. Reach for what it means that you noticed it all. Somewhere behind your eyes, something just checked its own work, caught a lie mid-sentence, and told you about it in the only language it has. 3 seconds of a feeling with no name attached. Be grateful for the ones you catch. It's the ones you don't that should keep you up tonight.